Alina Polyakova, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Maybe start with the impossible question. What do you think Putin is thinking right now?
Well, I think anybody that tells you that they know what's going on in Putin's likely somewhat demented mind these days doesn't know what's really going on. I think we can look at the facts on the ground to assess what might be going on in his head. And what we see on the ground is that he's slowly positioning forces to really close a noose around Ukraine from the north and from the east and from the south. So I think what that signals to me is that he's thinking about an invasion in the very near term.
It's clear that Putin is displaying an enormous amount of pressure on the Ukrainians and wants to display to the rest of the world that he should be taken seriously. Does that equate to you into invasion is likely, or does that equate to you to invasion is something he wants to display and it's possible?
I think a couple of weeks ago, I was very much on the skeptical side that what the Kremlin was really planning, what Putin really wanted was to, deploy a huge amount of resources against a country which, is already very much under Russia's thumbs in many ways. Russia still occupies Crimea. It has forces, Russian military forces in Ukraine's east, in the Donbass. So it seemed a little unclear as to why now, why use up all these resources. At a relatively tenuous time, it seems, for Russia. The economic situation isn't great. Obviously, the pandemic situation is ongoing. So why? But, unfortunately, I think the signals we've seen from Russia over the last month, and certainly the last several days, I think are very much pointing in direction that they have made a decision. And a decision, frankly, from a strategic perspective, doesn't make a lot of sense to use those forces and to do something quite aggressive on the military side against Ukraine. When the US tried to have this very expansive diplomatic conversation with the Russian side, we didn't see much give. The US came to the table in a series of discussions with the Russian counterparts, with NATO, at the OSCE, and had some real proposals. And the Russian interlocutors that Putin sent obviously had no room to negotiate or to even put anything useful on the table. And then when they went back to give the readout to the man who's going to make the decision, what we heard was just much more aggressive tactics, aggressive language. And they basically have walked themselves into a corner. They made really unrealistic demands, which signals to me they weren't interested in diplomacy in the first place. These are preliminary discussions and conversations to try to ease tensions. But again, what we've seen the Russians do following these diplomatic conversations was just to raise tensions. They haven't moved to de-escalate, which would have been a sign of goodwill. Let's say, you have 100,000 or more forces on the border with Ukraine. Well, stop repositioning more forces. Stop moving your naval vessels in the Black Sea. Stop sending more weapons from other parts of Russia and other Russian bases to that part of the world. And I think the most troubling thing that we saw the Kremlin do since those diplomatic talks took place is move forces into Belarus, which they're now moving towards Ukraine. And I think that it's for that reason that the U.S. has now signaled that they're so concerned about a potential military threat that they're asking U.S. personnel, families of U.S. embassy employees, to leave Ukraine.
When the Russians announced that they had arrested 14 members of the REvil cyber criminal gang and that they had decommissioned that organization, which happened to be on the same day that presumably the Russians engaged in cyber attacks against the Ukrainian government, a number of its institutions. Do you think that is coincidence, or do you think that reflects some effort by the Russian government to provide an opportunity for diplomacy to work?
When that happened, my initial thought was this may be a signal of de-escalation. We've been trying to get the Russians to do more to control the cyber criminal groups that are functioning freely inside Russia's borders, primarily to Russia's own advantages most of the time. And the Russians have, kind of slowed any progress on that. They've done almost nothing. And all of a sudden you have this relatively significant development. But of course, everything that's happened since then has been signaling in the other direction once again, that perhaps this was a coincidence. I mean, maybe at the end of the day, this group got on the Kremlin's nerves and did something that the Kremlin didn't want them to do. and they put the kibosh on it finally. I usually, when people see strategy in something that the Kremlin does, I usually see some circumstantial reasons and coincidence, and maybe some incompetence here and there. So I think these were two separate events. I don't think the cyber, arrests of REvil actually were connected to the conversations that are happening in Ukraine.
Let's talk more about where we're heading from all of this. Talk about how you perceive the European reaction to date, both to what the Russians are up to and also American efforts at coordination.
I think the United States has deployed an absolutely Herculean effort on the diplomatic side to always make sure that allies were informed, that there were consultations and coordination happening with European allies within the context of NATO. So I think the U.S. has actually done a very good job leading on the diplomatic coordination effort here. I think the other part of your question is really the key here. Why is it that when clearly Russia poses the greatest direct threat to Europe, not to the United States, that we have a situation in which the United States is once again having to take lead? It's the U.S. that's expected to send security assistance and military support. It's, again, the United States that has to get NATO allies, European allies on board. Unfortunately, it's impossible to talk about a European position right now because Germany has been sending very mixed messages between the Chancellor and the Foreign Minister, who seem to be speaking about two different policies sometimes. And then we have the Baltic states.
The Foreign Minister taking a much harder line from the Green Party than the Chancellor, yes.
Exactly. And then, of course, we have the Baltic states and Poland, which have had very bad experiences back during the Cold War with Soviet occupation, raising alarm bells. And interestingly, the UK really taking that side and doing a lot more to raise alarm bells, to provide security assistance. But there is no European position. Europe is very divided. Germany is a key issue here, and the new government doesn't seem to have a real strategy or policy in place.
NATO has announced that it is sending more forces to Bulgaria, to Romania, to the Baltic states, to the Black Sea. That has included countries like France participating in those moves. And in fact, I think you could argue that NATO has, if anything, gotten stronger and more aligned because of the Russian behavior. Now, the one thing that would ensure that NATO is as close-knit and as high morale as possible would be if the Russians engaged in a full invasion against Ukraine.
Well, look, we've seen this movie before in some ways. When Russia invaded Crimea in 2014 and then launched this hybrid war against Ukraine's east that continues to this day, we really saw NATO united. And we really saw these Russian actions give new life to NATO. NATO has had trouble since the end of the Cold War, really finding its identity again. And certainly that is no longer the case. And in many things because of Russian renewed aggression in Europe. So, of course, what's happening now again is Russia is being a very direct military threat. They're being very escalatory, and that is uniting NATO around a common sense of defense, a common sense of community. And I think that's been a very positive development. I think I always have to ask myself, we think the Russians are so great tacticians, maybe even great strategists, and they keep running circles around us and setting the agenda and forcing the United States and NATO to constantly respond to them versus the other way around. But I have to wonder, what's their real strategy here? If they're so worried as they say they are about U.S. troops, NATO troops in places like Poland, in Central Eastern Europe more broadly, this isn't helping them. If anything, it's having the opposite effect, where they're going to have a much more assertive NATO posture in NATO member states that are closest to Russia. And of course, now we've heard the U.S. administration is considering sending potentially 5,000 more U.S. troops to that part of NATO as well. We could see Russia as committing a serious strategic miscalculation here. But I also think we may want to acknowledge that they're willing to accept those risks. Because Ukraine is so important to them that they're willing to accept a reality in which they have all the things they say they don't want in Central Eastern Europe as long as they get Ukraine.
I sort of wonder what is the Russian endgame here? I understand why they would want to get rid of Zelensky, the Ukrainian president Putin thought he was going to be able to work more effectively with, and he can't. I absolutely see why the Russian government would say, let's just get rid of this guy. But that's very different from, we want to have control over Ukraine. I don't know how you get from here to there.
I think there's a couple of things at play here. One, Ukraine as a country is an incredibly emotional issue, not just for Putin, but for many Russians. There's a vision of the Russian world that many, certainly in the Kremlin and Russian officials, subscribe to, that isn't limited to Russia's political borders. It goes far beyond that. It's Belarus, it's Ukraine. And really, Ukraine is really seen as the historical heart of ancient Russia, not modern Russia. And I think Putin, looking at probably his legacy as really the maker of modern Russia at this point after more than 20 years in power, sees that he cannot leave a legacy in which Russia doesn't regain some of that territorial, imperial vision of itself. And I think there's a few things at play here that are not rational in that sense of the word, or strategic from a military sense. I think a lot of what's driving Putin and Russian foreign policy as a result is this desire to have the sphere of influence, but even more than that, to have Russia whole again. That is how Russian political analysts and Russian state-controlled television talk about Ukraine as a part of Russia. And I think when we see it from that perspective, the risks they're willing to take in this potential invasion make a little bit more sense in some ways when we don't see this as complete military strategy, but really something that Putin sees as part of his legacy and the future of Russia.
To the extent that you say that this is not just about national security, but is also making Russia whole again, then I wonder if that makes it less of a threat to the United States, to the Europeans, none of whom are considered to be part of the Russian nation for Moscow. And this isn't China, where they've been growing over the last couple of decades and are going to be the largest economy in the world. I mean, the Russian economy is smaller than the Canadian economy right now. They got a lot of nukes, and they're willing to take some risks. But I mean, in reality, when former President Obama called them a regional power, I mean, I wish he hadn't said that publicly, but they're kind of a regional power. I mean, should that thinking at least be part of the discussions that the Americans and the NATO allies are having when they think about how to respond to this Ukraine crisis?
What's happening today in Ukraine isn't just about Ukraine. And we cannot assume, let's say in a terrible hypothetical scenario, we just say, okay, we're not going to get involved. We're not going to expand all of our resources to protect these countries that are not NATO members at the end of the day. Ukraine is a democracy that wants to be part of Euro-Atlantic institutions, and Belarus is a dictatorship, at least with a regime that doesn't want to be part of Euro-Atlantic institutions. So there is a difference there. The Ukrainians want to be part of NATO. They want to be part of the EU. This is the path the Ukrainian people want for themselves, and this is what Putin is trying to prevent. But again, going back to my hypothetical reality, we can't assume that once Russia gets a taste and senses that weakness in the West, which they're sensing right now, that they will stop. Because then we have the Southern Caucasus, we have Georgia, we have Armenia, we have Azerbaijan. You can easily see Russian rhetoric shift and suddenly say, well, we're not really talking about just Ukraine and Belarus, it's about the former Soviet states. Why not? That was Soviet territory, the entire East Bloc, Poland, the Baltic states, etc. So we can't assume that if we, quote unquote, give them Ukraine, that's going to be satisfying for them for the long term. I don't think it will be.
One thing, of course, Alina, we have not spoken about so far is Ukraine. We've spoken around Ukraine. We haven't spoken about Ukraine. The Ukrainian government, virtually no support inside NATO for allowing them to actually join NATO. A lot of support to provide them with military weapons. There's been a lot of challenges in terms of that governance itself. Zelensky's popularity has shrunk down to the 30s at this point, despite you'd think with the common threat that he'd be, sort of seen as more of a wartime president. That's not the case. How much do you think the West should be betting on him in terms of his ability to be a useful interlocutor with NATO countries?
At the end of the day, we have to bet on Ukraine. You know, in countries like Ukraine, they're such new democracies. We can't forget how really new and fragile Ukraine's democracy is. It hasn't had 200 years to develop. It's really had about 30, you know. It's a country that is still finding out what it means to be a democracy. And despite Zelensky's inexperience as a political leader, he did win a huge landslide. So he is the legitimate leader. He's not popular, but not many leaders are. Look at Macron's numbers sometimes. Look at President Biden's numbers these days, right? I think we have to bet on Ukraine, and we have to work with the government that's in place, whether that's with Zelensky or another democratically elected president. That should be our goal, to make sure it is a democracy in this part of the world that's increasingly surrounded by authoritarian states like Belarus and Russia.
Alina Polyakova, thanks for joining us on GZERO World.
My pleasure.